Okay, we're trying something new here with the recording, so hopefully this works. Okay, so this is our continuing reading of Simondon's Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, Volume 2, and we're on the text History of the Notion of the Individual that we have been reading for the last couple months, and so we had some recording issues and we already went through the recap, so I won't do that again, but we're starting from page 520 in the PDF, and we're on St. Augustine. So I'll just get right into it. I'll read the first page or so. Actually, I think it's a short section, if I remember correctly. Yes. Okay, St. Augustine. St. Augustine boldly expresses the idea that the mediator is mediator not because he is the Word, but because he is man, is made man. Quote, Christ died but once, unquote. St. Augustine refuses the Stoics' expulsion of all the passions from the human being. Desire, fear, sadness can come from the love of the good and from charity and are not vices in themselves. Self-knowledge is the knowledge of a fact and not of an essence, as asserted in the treatise On the Trinity, where St. Augustine says that we know through an internal science that we are and that we live. Here, unlike in Plotinus, to know oneself is no longer to know the universe of realities, but to feel oneself live and exist. The feature that strikes St. Augustine is not so much some intrinsic property of intelligible things, but the independence of truths that we conceive with respect to individual minds. The reality of the individual is posited from the start. The conception of the individual in reflexive thought was able to be conditioned by the modi vivendi and social relations of the thinkers themselves. In this sense, what must be studied is the psychosocial unity formed by the thinker and his public. Two general types of organization of the dynamics of this relation can be distinguished as the extreme terms between which every mixed type can be interspersed. The closed and therefore homogeneous public and the open public, which is consequently heterogeneous with respect to the author. However, in ages when intellectual life is emphasized particularly, since intellectual elaboration involves a certain specialization, it is natural that the public is vast, open, and heterogeneous with respect to the author. The relation of the author to the public is consequently didactic and exoteric. This reflection corresponds to a meditation on the world, to a link with the object, and to a more theoretical than practical preoccupation. Conversely, in ages when preoccupation with spiritual life and personal salvation take precedence over intellectual life and knowledge of the world, the communal gathering of subjects who seek to work together towards salvation and purify themselves involves an esoteric position of the problem of the individual. At the twilight of the ancient world, the universal need for a practical search and for the meditation on personal salvation is indicated by the existence of a multitude of spiritual conventicles, like that of the Therapeutae of Lake Mariotis, and that of a countless number of Pythagorean, Hermetic, Platonic communities. The monasteries of Western Christianity have an analogous structure and provide fairly similar conditions for the development of thought. At this time, philosophical problems are posed in accordance with man's destiny, such as Christianity conceives it. The intelligence does not assert the autonomy of its methods and problems. The emotive, affective, voluntary aspects of life have as much importance as properly intellectual representation. Furthermore, the relation to the world of the public is a relation to the homogeneous and to the limited. There is somewhat of an identity of the world and the public, of the object and society. The unique relation to the world consequently becomes a relation to matter, and this world becomes foreign to the individual enveloped in a limited society that is for him principle and end, subject and object symbolized by a single substance. So yeah, this bit actually in the French text, sort of typographical difference here. So in the French text, we just have St. Augustine as one paragraph, and then there's a line break, and then the next bit is a separate section. So there's more sort of general reflections are separated from the section on St. Augustine, but in the translation it doesn't sort of come through in the same way. So the more general stuff in the second and third paragraphs here are separate from the first paragraph on St. Augustine. But we'll see more on St. Augustine as we continue with today's reading, because he is sort of known as one of the defenders of orthodoxy against the various heresies that appear in sort of the late Roman, early Christian era. But what we have here is a different depiction of what self-knowledge consists in compared to the sort of Greek Hellenistic doctrine, and especially the Neoplatonist doctrine, which has which considers the soul to be something that can know itself because the soul is itself something intelligible. The soul has the property of being something that is capable of being known and known through the intellect. Whereas for St. Augustine, the intellect is only sort of one aspect of the soul and not necessarily the most important one. And self-knowledge is knowledge not of the soul as something intelligible, but it's a sort of self-presentation or self-appearance of a living entity that we are. So we know ourselves insofar as we are alive, and not insofar as we are intelligible. And so because of this, we also can't necessarily sort of separate the passions from the intellect in the way that the Stoics, for example, wanted to do. So we can't say that the passions are sort of inherently negative properties of a human being. So the passions can also be part of what can be related to our relation to God. So you can have fear and sadness and desire and etc. from connection to God, and those passions can be the results of some sort of relation to God, and so they aren't necessarily negative for St. Augustine. And then we have the more general philosophical or sort of sociological historical account of philosophy in relation to its public. So philosophy is always, of course, directed towards a certain public, whether it's an individual reader or a small group or humanity as a whole. There's always some sort of idea for the writer of who should be the audience for this philosophical text. And here Simondon distinguishes between two sort of endpoints for what this audience can consist of. So it can either be a closed group, a small closed circle of readers on the one hand, or it can be sort of an open public, which eventually could coincide with humanity as a whole on the other hand. And he suggests that there's a sort of reciprocal relationship between these two extreme terms, and so when you have an era where the intellectual sort of preoccupation is with the relationship with the world, so what the scholar is primarily interested in is knowing the world in that type of era, then research about the individual necessarily takes the form of writing that is directed towards a small group, a closed group. Whereas, on the other hand, when you have an era that is more interested in the individual, then writing about the individual will take on this more public character, and so it's not directed towards a small group. And we can see the Christian era, the beginning of the Christian era, as a sort of transition from the Hellenistic era, where knowledge of the world was more important, to an era where knowledge of the individual is held to be more important. And so it's in Christianity we see the doctrine of the individual become something that's not just directed to a closed group of readers, but is sort of directed to the world as a whole and an open public. Okay, so let's go on to the next section, if someone else would like to read.
I can read the heresies. Eastern heresies. One of the first signs of the existence of these communitarian conditions of reflexive thought is the reaction of Christian thought against the Eastern heresies, relative either to the question of the Trinity or to the Christological question. What they both fundamentally have in common is a change in the paradigm of individuality applied to the conception that divinity can be made man. In Sabellius and the modalists, the Word is not considered the Son of God for fear of falling into polytheism. In the same spirit, Arius only accepts the Son of God as person on condition of making him a creature of God. These two thoughts highlight a common preoccupation: to safeguard the intellectual purity of the representation of God that has been formulated, and therefore to elucidate the mysterious nature of the Trinitary dogma by thinking divine reality as an individual identitarian unity, not as a reality that can be grasped merely through the categories of participation, thereby rejecting the principle of the excluded middle. This refusal of the principle of the excluded middle is palpable in the formula that Athanasius in the Council of Nicaea opposed to Arius. The unity of substance in God does not exclude the diversity of persons. This logically supposes that two incompatible structures are simultaneously existent in the divine being. These are the same formulas with which Cyril of Alexandria in the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD condemned Nestorius. The duality of human and divine natures in Christ does not prevent Mary from being Theotokos, the Mother of God. Lastly, these are the same reasons why the school of Antioch was considered heretical even before Nestorius, because it refused to see in Jesus Christ anything other than a man filled with the graces of divinity, and because it avoided the metaphysical God-man combinations that require the category of participation, and the refusal of the principle of excluded middle. Here, theocentrism is the mark of an inspiration that conforms with Neoplatonic thought, seeking to determine the intelligible structure of things by remaining faithful to the principle of identity. Western heresies. The Western heresies, Pelagianism in particular, also manifest this defiance against participation. This doctrine denies the hereditary transmission of original sin, the justification of man by the merits of Christ taking as victim, and the importance of the means of grace and the sacraments of the Church, and the sacraments that the Church makes available to the faithful. St. Augustine opposes the efficacious reality of the Church to this thought. Grace is what establishes this necessary participation. The good can come to the soul only from a special grace. Salvation only belongs to those who are predestined by God for all eternity. Unbaptized dead infants are damned. The Gentiles who have not been touched by the grace of Christ have never attained virtue. The Church is the necessary institution for the dispensation of divine graces, i.e., for the maintenance of participation between divinity and humanity. Donatism is critiqued in the same spirit. According to St. Augustine, who also fought against this heresy, the value of a sacrament should not depend on the individual purity or impurity of the priest who bestows it. Formalism of the sacrament is what establishes participation, not the individual reality of the priest. Under these conditions, it is inevitable that man cannot be transparent to himself in his individual reality. The possession of spiritual power does not provide intellectual penetration. In his work On the Soul and Its Origin, St. Augustine protests against those who believe that man, quote, can discuss his own quality or nature as a whole, as if none of himself eluded him, unquote. This is why St. Augustine, concerning the controversy over the origin of the soul, hesitates without concluding between traducianism, which derives our soul from that of our parents, and creationism, which makes the soul into a creature ex nihilo. The doctrine of St. Augustine, therefore, aims in particular at establishing the reality of participation through the Church. His thought conforms with the doctrine of participation. The story of his conversion shows that individual unity is not as strong as commencing participation. Conversion is like a struggle between individual unity and the force of participation. The old man is the singular man according to a thought that conforms with the principle of excluded middle. Man at the moment of conversion is a divided being, in which a struggle arises between the part that is still purely individual and the part that already participates. After having vanquished the other part and detaching from it, this part that participates becomes the whole again. At that time, the world to which the old man was attached is no longer but nugae nugarum, toy of toys. There is a profound difference in structure between the man before conversion and the converted man. The former subsists, the latter participates. In the Eastern Heresy section, this association of the principle of identity with, or I guess the opposition of the principle of identity to the notion of participation is, if I'm understanding that right, is interesting. So it's these heresies that say basically that God can't be more than one thing and also a unity, versus what becomes the Orthodox position that there is both, that there's this unity in the Trinity or the Trinity in unity. But then it seems like participation is used in a different sense in the section on the Western heresies, where there's this, the individual can sort of have access to grace through participation via the church, but only through like the formal aspects of the church, so that it doesn't matter if it's a good priest, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, this is not something that I know in a lot of detail, but a lot of the controversies within the church in the early Christian era, so like 5th century to I guess 7th or 8th century, had to do with these sort of apparent contradictions in Christian doctrine. So, in particular, in relation to the Trinity and the nature of Christ. So there's so the Orthodox, what became the Orthodox doctrine is that God is both three and one at the same time. So three persons in one substance, and so many of these what were later characterized as heresies. Many of these schools of thought held that either the three or the one side had to be sort of given up or reduced in importance. So you either conceive God as like this singular unity, and then the Son of God is a created being with a sort of lesser status than God Himself. That's the Arian doctrine, and or you can conceive of the threeness as being primary, and so there's like three gods essentially, and that would be a different kind of heresy. But and then the other sort of topic of controversy was the nature of Christ as both God and man. And so again, there's a sort of contradiction in the Orthodox doctrine, or at least as Simondon puts it here, this participation that goes beyond the law of excluded middle, and then various heretical traditions either held that Christ was a human being who received divine grace or something along those lines, or held that Christ was divine and only sort of took on a human form or human appearance. But the Orthodox doctrine rejects both of those alternatives and holds on to this idea of Christ as both human and divine at the same time, fully human and fully divine. And so these are sort of the topics of controversy in the early Christian era, and what Simondon sort of takes to be noteworthy here, especially in Augustine's opposition to these heresies, is this notion of participation that extends beyond the law of excluded middle, and so that allows for an entity to participate in contradictory qualities or contradictory properties, and then in the section on the Western heresies, so these ones are not related to the Trinity or the nature of Christ, but so the Pelagian heresy held that there's no such thing as original sin. Infants are born without sin, and so it's only through free will that humans are affected by sins, or that it's only through free will that human beings sort of descend into sin, and so you can sort of hold individuals responsible for the sins that they commit, but there's no such thing as original sin that inheres in humans independently of what actions they perform. And then the Donatist doctrine held that the sacraments of the church were not effective unless the priests who performed them lived a sort of blameless life. And so if the priest was a sinner, then the sacraments were not effective. So marriage or baptism or whatever other rites were not sort of performed properly or didn't have efficacy if the priest was not morally blameless. And St. Augustine rejects both of these doctrines, and he holds that it's only through the church that there is salvation, but it's through the church as a whole or as an institution, as opposed to through the individual priest as a member of the church that you receive salvation. So one of this is that infants who die before baptism are damned, as Simondon points out here. So there's no such thing as or because of original sin, they're born as sinners, and it's only through baptism and integration into the church that they can be saved. So that's a particularly harsh doctrine. And we also have this notion that what Simondon here calls the formalism of the sacrament. So it's not the priest as an individual who lives a morally blameless life who has the capacity to perform sacraments. It's the church as a whole, as an institution, or as a sort of descendant of the apostolic tradition that has this capacity to perform sacraments, and the priest is just sort of an officer of the church.
I don't know enough about the like church history to say for sure, but it seems like there would be some continuity between this rejection of donatism at this early stage, and then the issues that lead to the Protestant Revolution later on, because a lot of the Protestant objections to the Catholic Church had to do with like very bad problems with corruption and officers of the church.
Yeah, you can see that this Augustinian theory that the church is or doctrine that the church is sort of a whole and has to be treated as a whole, as opposed to having any sort of individual mediation by the priest. You can see how this doctrine can lead to an account or a sort of acceptance of sort of morally blameworthy action on the part of the priest. So if like on the other hand, if you like in the Donatist doctrine, you have a very high standard of behavior for the priest, because if they are not morally blameless, then they're not actually they effectively are not priests anymore because they can't perform the sacraments. And on the other hand, if you allow for the effectiveness of the sacraments, even when the priest is morally blameworthy, then you are sort of opening the door for corruption or various kinds of morally blameworthy behavior by the priest, and this doesn't sort of affect the status of the church, and so you can see how this can lead to dissatisfaction among members of the church if they perceive that the priests and the church officials are not living a life in accordance with what the doctrines that they preach, the moral doctrines that they preach. And so, yeah, this type of contradiction was one of the big motivations for the Reformation, like I guess about 900 years later.
Recently I'm reading like a Spinoza's Ethics. Kind of like of course like Spinozian ethics is definitely comes after this tradition of Christianity and so on and so on. But while listening to this part, I just thought of the idea of like how it is connected to the Plato's, like the soul and body is one, and then Spinozian substance, and then like Jesus as like a representation of the God, like actually corporeal representation of God, and so on and so on. Like, I think there are some kind of interesting points hidden as far as I understand. For example, last time I thought the God, God, I mean, the God substance includes all attributes. I mean, individuals' attributes as a part of the whole. But my colleague criticized that. I think God is God as just a human corporeal body. So, but like by reading this one, I think I don't know, that's possible because like some people long time ago would think that way, would have thought that way as well. Sorry, like it sounds kind of a little bit like vague and kind of like a abstract. But my point is that like how this part, I mean the connected to the Plato's philosophy, and then later on like a Spinoza maybe influenced by this kind of ideas, and then developed the Spinoza his own kind of philosophy about the relations between individual human beings and God, and then substance and attribute and mode, modification, everything.
Yeah, yeah. There's we'll see in a few pages. We'll see. I think we should get to that point today. Saint Anselm. He is probably the first, or to my knowledge, he's the first to express explicitly this idea that God contains all perfections, and so he has the famous ontological argument to say that for the existence of God. So if if God contains, or if we define God, if the concept of God is the most perfect being, or that than which nothing greater can be thought, then if God existed only in the intellect, if God didn't have actual existence outside the intellect, then we could conceive of a being like God, except also existing outside the intellect, and that would be a greater perfection. And so there's a contradiction in asserting that we think of God as the being that has all perfections, and then also thinking that God might not exist. So we have to conclude that if God is the being that contains all perfections, then God necessarily exists. And this ontological doctrine, ontological argument for the existence of God is definitely one of the key ideas that Spinoza develops in the Ethics in his account of God, which of course is very different than the Christian one, because God is the one substance of which everything else is a mode. But yeah, so there's definitely a line of influence from this Christian philosophy and this notion of God as containing all perfections to Spinoza's concept of God as the one substance. But there's also a big transformation that this concept undergoes in that development as well.
So it's not really bizarre to think God as some kind of, I mean, God can be represented as a corporeal being like Jesus. Is it too much or too bizarre to think that way?
Right. Yeah. So that was one of the sort of central points of dispute in the early church, is exactly what relation there is between, or what how can we understand Christ as being both a fully human being with a body and every sort of attribute of a human being, and then on the other hand also being God, being God the Son, part of the Trinity, and having every attribute of divinity, and so the Orthodox doctrine holds that both of these are true at the same time, that there's a sort of dual nature of Christ, in the sense that he's fully human and fully divine at the same time, and then some of the different heretical doctrines either held that Christ was just a human being who received some sort of blessing or grace or mission or whatever from God, or on the other hand, they held that Christ was a divine being who just appeared in human form. And so they sort of sacrificed one side of this opposition to the other. So the Orthodox doctrine has to sort of go beyond the law of excluded middle and hold that Christ can participate in both divinity and humanity at the same time, even though these are contradictory qualities.
Wow, thank you. Sorry if so. Another question. Can I like there somewhere I can't really like point out like the part, but as far as I understand, like at some point we don't have to think about knowledge. Like we don't have to be epistemological. Instead of that, the better ontological. Like we can just feel. When Angus read, I thought like that is somewhere in the part Angus read, but so that means like we can just like instead of like trying to be the knowledgeable about everything, we just like what does it mean by the feel here? I need to find out the exact spot, the exact part. But anybody who is with me, like
Yeah, I think I know the part you're referring to. So that was in the section on Augustine at the beginning of today's reading.
Sorry.
Yeah, so for Augustine, our knowledge of ourselves is not an intellectual knowledge as it is in Neoplatonism. So it's not that. So in Neoplatonism, there's this doctrine that we know the soul knows itself because the soul has the property of being something intelligible, something that can be grasped by the intellect. Whereas St. Augustine will hold instead that we know ourselves as living beings, so as beings that have a life, and this life includes the intellect, but also various passions, and so the soul the soul doesn't have a sort of transparency to itself. So there are aspects of our soul that we are not aware of, that only God knows, that we only have sort of a limited access to our own soul, and we know ourselves as living beings that have passions and desires and so on, and not just as intellectual beings. So this is Augustine's doctrine against the Stoics, or against Hellenistic philosophy in general.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. But let's move on to the next section. Ollie, maybe you'd like to read the next bit?
Sure. Cassiodorus. This duality of conceiving the human individual is prominent in Cassiodorus, who, in his treatise on the soul, opposes the proofs of the immortality of the soul according to secular letters, and those based on the political authorities. The first proofs, which are in particular drawn from the Phaedo by way of the discussions contained in the works of Saint Augustine and Claudianus Marmartus, define the soul as a simple substance, a natural form, different from the matter of its body. The soul is thus defined here by itself as individually isolated. Conversely, according to the proofs derived from the veridical teachers, the spirituality of the soul derives from its relation of participation in divine reality. The soul is made in the image of God. Cassiodorus considers these proofs that utilize the relation of participation as specifically Christian and superior to the proofs of the Phaedo. And the spirituality of Saint Augustine wants to establish the moral life of the individual is participation in the established order. The very relations established between the different sciences and knowledges that form the content of the spiritual city conform with this structure of participation. The trivium and the quadrivium find their justification in their usefulness for the study of the purely divine sciences. The sciences no longer have their individuality or their specialty. They are totalized in an encyclopedic form that is indispensable for liturgy and ecclesiastical competence. They are limited by the relation of participation that integrates them functionally into the corpus of the sciences. They lose their power of self-creative discovery and no longer have the goal of promoting themselves. Participation suppresses the internal finality and power of indefinite growth of each individualized reality. Such is the role of the encyclopedias that were written at the time and that constitute something like cities of the sciences. They subjugate the knowledges inherited from the pagan antiquity to the church. The relation of participation, which it deploys itself starting from the active center of revelation, extends up to the ancient doctrines, turns them toward it by depriving them of their autonomy. This conversion is practiced by Isidore, the Archbishop of Seville, in his Etymologies, and by Bede the Venerable in his De Natura Rerum, which was inspired by Isidore and augmented by frequent reminiscences of Pliny the Elder. Refusing citizens' right to individual opinion, the same relation of participation appears on a particularly crucial ground, that of the criteria to be employed for discerning truth in matters of faith. The set of rules is exposited by Vincent de Rerin's The Commonitorium in AD 354. The opinion of the majority must be given preferential treatment from the start by distrusting private opinions. In the same way, the opinion of the ancient must be followed. Ultimately, if these two methods make room for error, the decision of ecumenical council must intervene. Short of this, the search for the opinion shared by all orthodox masters is fruitful. The tradition grows by way of development and clarification. For example, such that the new participates with the old continuously and never by way of addition or innovation, which would disrupt the continuity necessary for participation. The only mediation invoked in these different examples is consequently that of participation, of continuous participation, the mediation proper to philosophical thought, which calls for invention, not participation through continuity, for creation, not simple development, cannot be suitable for this ecclesiastical thought. Enough?
Yes, let's stop there. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So Cassiodorus, as Angus has posted in the chat here, he's maybe not a very sympathetic thinker for modern authors or modern readers. So he holds that he first makes this distinction on proofs of the immortality of the soul between the proofs that come from secular authors or pagan authors like Plato, and the proofs that come from what he calls here the veridical authorities or the church authorities. So in Plato's Phaedo, there are arguments that show that the soul is immortal, and Cassiodorus holds these arguments not to truly give us the nature of the soul. And it's only in Christian writers who derive the immortality of the soul from God and from the divine origin of the soul. It's only in these proofs that we truly grasp the immortality of the soul in its reality. And so, as a sort of consequence of this, is that we have a subordination of secular knowledge to the church. So the seven liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, these are useful insofar as they contribute to the development of the church. So like music is, you should study music so that you can perform the church liturgy properly. But they don't have a sort of inherent value, and they don't have an autonomy like they did in the pre-Christian era. And so developing music or geometry or whatever for its own sake is not something that has any any value. It's only insofar as you are studying music and geometry for the sake of the church that those studies have any value. And we see so in this era, in this sort of early Christian era, we find these encyclopedias that authors write. So they sort of gather together all of the knowledge that they have available to them from the pagan world and put it together into these encyclopedias or compendiums that contain all of the knowledge on a particular topic that is available. But a lot of these authors are not original in the sense that they don't develop geometry or astronomy or whatever. They just collect the information that's already available for the use of the church.
This idea of the refusal of the right to individual opinion, and together with the subordination of the sciences to the life of the church, it's sort of like the opposite of what Simondon valorizes in that discussion on the technician earlier in Volume 2. Sort of forecloses the possibility of having this independent and non-communally mediated access to the object of scientific, or I guess also philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, I think that's right. So for just as a reminder for any listeners who don't remember that passage, so in one of near the beginning of this text on the history of the notion of the individual, Simondon argues that the sort of beginnings of philosophy in the pre-Socratic philosophers, it has to do with the role of these people as technicians, as people that had this technical knowledge that doesn't rely on sort of valorization or approval or endorsement by the community. So like Thales uses his astronomical knowledge to predict the olive harvests and make a fortune. So this technical knowledge is the sort of basis for the development of philosophical doctrines as sort of independent from religious thought that exists only in the communal form. And so we see here a complete reversal of that sort of approach to knowledge. So the individual only has knowledge insofar as that knowledge contributes towards the church as a communal institution, and there's no sense in which the individual should sort of advance knowledge or advance their studies for their own sake or for the sake of gaining access to the world independently of any communal institutions, and yeah, so it's completely subordinated to the community.
Actually, I think this reading is really amazing. Cause by reading this, I mean the thinkers' ideas, definitely helpful to understand. And as I told you before, Spinozan ideas too. Cause as Angus said, in Spinozan ideas, extension is as far as that's important. Attributes individual, as far as I understand, individual as an attributes of substance. Extension is available, but here the ideas is limited, and then it is subordinate to the sign of system. So, but actually, Cassiodorus also has his own logic, actually, because in the first part of my reading, soul is deprioritized, and that's kind of the symbol of God. And then we individuals needed to follow the God itself. So in order to do that, they needed some kind of systemized, some hierarchical system, and then that kind of makes sense in his time. But at the end of the day, it also suppresses the development of the creativity or creating some kind of the free individuals at the same time. That's why Spinoza is like a rebellious, right? Like a revolutionary at his time, like because he had to be against this kind of dominant ideas. Then
Yeah, I think that's right. Like Spinoza explicitly defends freedom of thought as for the individual as one of the key principles for the stability of a state, and for the so a state that tries to legislate what people are allowed to think or say or write will uh, will inevitably contradict what some people think. So some people will always think differently than what the state wants them to think, and so those people will be dissatisfied with the state and will be likely to want to overthrow the state, and so the state that tries to restrict what people think will be an unstable state, and will lead to turmoil and instability of various kinds. And so for Spinoza, the individual freedom of individuals to think what they want and to express their thoughts is one of the sort of key principles of protecting the state. And so this is obviously completely opposed to Cassiodorus's doctrine, according to which the individual has to subordinate their studies to the church. So I think you're right to say that this is one aspect where Spinoza is definitely a revolutionary in opposing any sort of communal veto power over what people are allowed to think.
Oh, thank you. One more thing. I think a bit small question is like, is that related to? I mean, for example, Cassiodorus' idea is related to the political situation, like at the time, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not that familiar with his sort of circumstances of what the political situation is at the time of writing, but I think we can also connect this with some of the divisions within the church at the time, like in the early Christian era. So there's multiple different positions within the church that are all competing to be recognized as the orthodox position, and we have these church councils where they condemn certain doctrines as heretical, so this obviously makes intellectual inquiry very high stakes. So like holding the wrong doctrine about the nature of Christ or the nature of the Trinity could mean exclusion from society and excommunication. So yeah, it's I think this may have something to do with this doctrine of rejecting individual inquiry as a sort of way of preventing these kind of divisions within the church.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let's go on to Saint Anselm. Read that section. Saint Anselm. It is nevertheless appropriate to note just how much the very method of participation can be taken in different senses. There is no common measure between participation in divine reality through revelation and writings, and participation on the basis of St. Anselm's essay in Intellectu, being in the understanding. In St. Anselm, the essay in Intellectu can lead us to God because the understanding is already a mediation between faith and the beatific vision of the chosen ones. We then pass from the per aliud, through something else, to the per se, through itself. There is still participation, but this participation is a relation that goes in a direction opposite to the habitual sense. In discovery, thought is directed from the part that participates to the being, which is the object of participation. The fool who says there is no God possesses in his understanding the notion of God, and what he comprehends is in his understanding, even if he does not comprehend that this thing exists. When St. Anselm goes from esse in intellectu to esse per se, he does not go from the concept to the real thing, but from partial reality to complete reality. There is no change of modality in the judgments that explain his reasoning. Thought always moves toward the affirmation of reality. Quote, and assuredly that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality which is greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. Unquote. This path of participation, going from the part to the whole, and not from the whole to the letter of its degraded expression, sometimes appears in St. Augustine. Quote, "For never yet was, nor will be, a soul able to conceive of anything better than you. And if you were not incorruptible, I could in my thoughts have reached unto something better than my God." Unquote. Negative theology proceeds along this path. Lastly, let us note that all the great rules of Christian morality are given as negative. It is for this reason that they can claim to attain universality, for an ethics is founded by passing from the reality of a particular negative rule to the reality of the unique basis that positively founds ethics. The foundation of the Platonic dialectic is rediscovered in this path of participation, through which one ascends from the conditioned back to the unconditioned that conditions it. Quote, "But God surely, and everything that belongs to God is in every way in the best possible state." Unquote. In Plato, participation can occur in two senses. It goes from the good to the ideas, and from the ideas to the good. The possibility of this double movement also exists in Christian thought, since God is creator but also redeemer, Alpha and Omega, Father and Son. But two very different currents of Christian thought appeared that would be called the movement of procession and the movement of conversion. In the first, participation is established by way of a descending continuity, both through time and through the hierarchy of beings, by undergoing an ontological degradation that can only be reduced. The community consequently contributes to each new individual that which ties him to the past and connects him back to a long and solid tradition by making him participate in it. The individual is one who is always new with respect to the time of revelation. The individual is new, and therefore he does not participate in a processive participation by himself. Whence the importance related to the initiatory rituals in the community. The spiritual birth of baptism is the establishment of participation through procession. The individual is therefore no longer something new. He is clothed in a new name, connected by a name to the processive community. He is purified of his novelty, which was isolation and foreign nature. Every man can baptize, for every man who participates can propagate this processive participation. In the other aspect of the Christian tradition, the movement of conversion is primordial. Consequently, participation can be established starting from the individual, without the aid of the community, by way of a simultaneously interior and exterior discovery. The community still exists, but it no longer has the same meaning. It is not a closed circle entrusted with processive communication, but the active and creative kernel that is the overseer of the other individuals in the discovery that conversion is. The circle can be both the image of inclusion as well as the image of exclusion, of the whole as well as the part. A community can be constitutive as well as constituted. The Christian can be the Platonic prisoner returned from the cave, as well as the adept of the initiatory faith of a community among other closed communities. This double movement created an essential ambiguity in Christian thought, and this ambiguity is reflected in the treatment that the problem of individuality receives. The individual is the being who is capable of isolation, and this isolation itself can seem like a curse, whether it be on the symbolic level of the stray flock or on the theoretical level of the dereliction of the sinner. Isolation seems like a misfortune. In the tradition of participation through procession, the temporal isolation of the individual is a prefiguration of damnation. The excommunicated is in some sense temporally damned. To excommunicate is to deprive of participation. The temporal church, mediator of communication, isolates from it or receives into it those whom it wants to damn or save. The chosen one is not merely a just and rewarded, judged being, but also a being definitively integrated into the spiritual community of the chosen ones. Generation is a degradation to the extent that it creates the individual. The temporal concerns the individual. These two aspects are prominent in St. Augustine. The preoccupation that animates him against Donatism and Pelagianism connects back to participation through procession, but his spiritual life reveals a search for participation through conversion. St. Anselm is on the path of this participation through conversion. Gonillo of Marmoutier, on the contrary, opposes St. Anselm in the name of authority and revelation. He defends the point of view of the insipience, unreasonable, introduced by St. Anselm. The intellectus for Gonillo will no longer play this mediating role between faith and the beatific vision that St. Anselm assigns it. However, faith as well as beatific vision are attitudes of participation that connect the individual back to the community of the temporal church or the triumphant church. Conversely, the intellectus is the mark and activity proper of the individual, who applies his forces to knowledge and who, passing from the per aliud to the per se, from the multiple to the one, bends from the conditioned back to the conditioning. Consequently, as we learn in the Monologium, the intellectus is that which forms the unity of the individual in his search. The intellectus, in fact, starts with the multiplicity of truths, which are not just truths of pronouncements, but also of opinions and of the will, of actions, right intention and right actions. The true does not belong to judgment alone. It can be said of the will, of the senses, and of essence. Reflexive thought, which discovers truths, participates in reason, the eminent and unique reality of which truths are like various aspects. In this sense, reflexive activity guided across every ground of human existence is indeed a movement of conversion. In such a doctrine, the individual who thinks is no longer a being disinherited from the search for the mediator as a creator of a community, but a limited force who, guided well, is capable of discovering the divine. The intellectus, which is reflexivity, is not the opposite of faith. Fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding, applies for all dogmas, including that of incarnation, which is consequently no longer belief in an exceptional event founded on revelation, as St. Anselm wants to establish in his Cur Deus Homo, why God is man. In this theory of conversion, everything happens as if the individual had the possibility to introduce the unpredictable initiatives of a free being, whereas the universe would be in eternal and invariable order, all in one piece. Conversely, in participation through procession, the divine drama unfolds within a discontinuous universe in which creation, sin, and redemption are introduced by the unpredictable initiatives of this free being who is God. Participation through procession introduces the continuity of the supernatural into a discontinuous nature. Continuity alone comes from God. On the contrary, mediation through conversion supposes that the individual is stable, that the universe is stable and continuous. Consequently, the activity of the individual is efficacious. The individual can start with himself, for he is not foreign to the whole of being. He is particular but not isolated. He is already something real. He can start with the realities that are within him, with the truths that contain his opinion, his right opinions, his right actions, his true judgments, and his senses. Reflection is endowed with fecundity, for it is what allows passage from the multiple to the one, from the per alio to the per se. Thus, two opposed ethical and epistemological attitudes concerning the individual appear in the Christian tradition. It does not seem at present that they have been able to be deeply reconciled. On the side of participation through procession, we find certain doctrines like that of Bossuet and Joseph de Maistre. On the side of participation through conversion, we find thoughts like those of Malebranche, La Bertonnière, and Maurice Blondel. Yeah, sorry, that ended up being a longer section than I anticipated, so we probably should have broken that up into two. It would be nice to have some paragraphs in this long section as opposed to just one giant block. But that's how he writes, so we have to live with it. Right, so I went through this argument already, the ontological argument that St. Anselm gives for the existence of God. So this argument, in opposition to the way Cassiodorus sort of subordinates these rational arguments for the immortality of the soul or the existence of God to arguments from authority, from Revelation and the Church Fathers and so on. So in opposition to that approach, St. Anselm holds that through reason, we're capable of grasping the existence of God. And so reason has this sort of, or the understanding has this role of a sort of mediation between faith on the one hand, so faith as something that we have when we don't have knowledge, and then the vision that the elect have of God, so the sort of immediate knowledge of God that saints have. So the understanding through which we grasp the being of God is sort of intermediate between those two. So there's a sort of participation through the intellect or through the understanding. So we are capable of participating in divine reality through our understanding. So there's a certain valorization of the understanding here, even if it's sort of enclosed within the Christian doctrine. There's still this notion that the understanding has a sort of value of its own. And then we have this distinction that Simondon makes between these two opposed sort of traditions within Christianity. So we have on the one hand, we have this sort of tradition of participation. So it's a tradition in which the individual has value or reality through its mediation with the divine, and so it involves like we saw with Cassiodorus, this sort of subordination of the individual to the church as an institution, and we saw this also with Augustine. So the church as an institution has the role of preserving tradition, the apostolic tradition, and individuals are saved by virtue of being included in the church and belonging to this tradition. And so that's what the importance of baptism comes from, is that it takes an individual and makes them part of this institution that preserves the tradition of the apostles. And this is the one sort of tradition within Christianity. And then there's the other form, the other tradition, which he calls this tradition of conversion. So this is one. In this tradition, there's a sort of role of the individual in reaching the divine reality, as opposed to this mediation through the church. So the individual, through the act of conversion, sort of discovers God within themselves, but also outside of themselves. So the individual has the capacity to reach this sort of grasp of God without going through the mediation of the church. So this sort of disjunction between these two traditions is present within the church as a whole, but also within individual authors. So like for Augustine, there's this emphasis on the role of the church as an institution, but there's also emphasis on the role of conversion. And like he gives a very detailed autobiographical account of his own conversion to Christianity. And so there's this sort of tension within his work that reproduces the tension within the Christian tradition as a whole.
Yeah, this idea of procession sort of made me think of in Volume 1, the discussion of the one of the sections on the collective, and Simondon said there that the collective itself continues to individuate by the incorporation of the pre-individual shares of new members of the collectives. Maybe this would be one way in which that could happen. And then the idea of conversion, which is kind of like a spontaneous individual salvation without mediation by the community, kind of makes me think of, what little I know about it, Zen Buddhism, the idea that everybody has this Buddha nature that can be sort of spontaneously and almost accidentally awakened, like in the Gateless Gate. There are all these strange anecdotes about interactions that led to sudden enlightenment, or maybe even that in the section on anxiety in Volume 1, where he suggests that there are ways in which the transformation that usually takes the collective to happen can happen individually. Maybe this would be another example of that. Some kind of totally individual religious conversion through the understanding, or through I don't know, maybe something supernatural.
Yeah, that's a good reminder of some of the points from Volume 1 that are related here, and it certainly seems like Simondon leans more towards the side of the procession account, where the individual can sort of reach something beyond themselves, this trans-individual, only through the collective and through some sort of mediation through the collective. But at the same time, he also emphasizes in other passages the sort of spiritual ordeal that is involved in forming a collective and sort of reaching the trans-individual. So it's not just that a bunch of people get together and decide to form a collective, that you sort of achieve this access to the trans-individual. There has to be this sort of conversion within each of those individuals to form a real collective. And so even though Simondon sort of, at least at a first approximation, leans more toward the side of the procession and the role of the collective, there's still this individual aspect to this individual conversion aspect to his account of collective individuation and the grasp of the trans-individual.
I wonder if we could see this as another instance of a situation where two extreme terms are kind of united in the middle through Simondon's account. So there would be like a procession that's preceded by a conversion in the collective with the ordeal of solitude that leads to the, induction into the community.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So in this sort of general schema of thought that Simondon uses regularly is to present this opposition between two opposed terms and then try to find an intermediate, not in the sense of like a mixture of the two, but like this middle point out of which the two opposed terms can be generated in this sort of genetic intuition that he uses as the sort of methodological principle of his philosophical work. So I think there's definitely an aspect, or we can definitely try to understand Simondon's account of collective individuation and of the trans-individual as trying to find that middle point between these two opposed accounts or opposed traditions within Christianity. And I think he takes it that these opposed traditions within Christianity are each grasping something real or some aspect of the real, but only sort of partially, or they have like a partial grasp on the real, and so there's this need to grasp the intermediate term or the mediation between the two that will allow for both terms to be generated out of it.
As Angus pointed out, like Buddhism really maybe it's kind of like possible to think of the Buddhism because there are two big branches in Buddhism as well, like according to the way to reach like the Buddha's like the idea, like one is like a more focus on personal meditation things like that, and then the other one is the opposite way. So it's kind of interesting, like in terms of religion, not only Christianity but also other religions like have some kind of common points. I mean, in terms of like the relation God, so-called absolute being, and then individuals. And one more thing I noticed is maybe procession versus conversion. Maybe that has to do with like delusion breaks official versus like continuity. So new genesis like possible from not just like a continuous procession, but from the breakage official, like some kind of some transitional moment to makes the continue to possible. Well, what do you think?
Yeah, the point about this sort of disjunction between a sort of collective tradition and an individualist tradition within Buddhism is an interesting one. And I mean, I certainly am even less knowledgeable about the history of Buddhism than I am about the history of Christianity. But yeah, there's definitely a sort of opposition between like the more collective tradition that treats monastic orders and belonging to a monastery and having this sort of collective position as what is essential, and then as Angus pointed out, the Zen tradition and maybe some other ones that emphasize the way that the individual can achieve enlightenment and not by mediation through some sort of collective like a monastery or something like that. So yeah, I think we could probably find in any religious tradition that you pick, you'll find both of these aspects present, and you'll probably be able to like even zoom in further, and like in particular authors or particular doctrines, you can probably find both aspects present, and this tension between these two opposed sides present in any religious text or doctrine. On that second point about the Deleuzian sort of interpretation of this, I would say that so I think you're referring to the development in the logic of sense, where he talks about the fissures and the crack up and so on. I don't remember that stuff particularly well. It's been a few years since I read Logic of Sense, but my sort of recollection is that I think what's going on here is probably somewhat different, in that for Simondon, he always wants to find this intermediate point, or this point of mediation between two opposed terms, out of which those terms can be generated. And I think that's a different sort of philosophical methodology than Deleuze's methodology, which, I think tries to find, I guess, a system of differences out of which something can be generated. That might be a sort of a oversimplification, but it's not based on finding this intermediate point in the way that Simondon's work is. So yeah, I think I would be sort of hesitant to try to like line things up between Simondon's work and Deleuze's work, even though of course there's a great degree of influence from Simondon on Deleuze.
Yeah, thank you. Much clearer. Thank you.
Right. I think this next bit is actually, maybe we should stop here, because the next one is a couple pages. So yeah, let's stop here. Unless anyone has any other questions or comments on what we've read today before we close.
Well, it seems that I didn't realize that Simondon studied this much. So his ideas is not out of the blue. I mean, wow, it has like a really strong foundation. So it's amazing to check this part particularly. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like in the text itself, in volume 1 of Individuation, there's very little in the way of like citations or references to other authors. So yeah, it sort of gives the appearance as if he sort of just sat down and thought everything up himself. But we see in this text, of course, that he's developing these ideas in reference to a philosophical tradition that he wants to sort of continue, and yeah, so he's obviously very well versed in the history of philosophy, and he wants to conceive of what he's doing as a continuation of a philosophical tradition. So he wants to treat his account of the individual in volume 1 as a development of these sort of contradictory aspects of the doctrine of the individual that appear, or these fragmentary aspects of this doctrine of the individual that appear in different authors throughout the history of philosophy. And he wants to give a sort of coherent account that fits together all these different fragments.
That he really sort of deeply engaged with someone like Rosalinas or Cassiodorus, or that he is getting a lot of this from the Emile Breillet book that he mentioned in an earlier section. I guess it's hard to know.
It's hard. Yeah, I haven't read Breillet's book, so I don't know to what extent Simon, like he does mention that he's sort of following Breillet's history, but I'm not sure to what extent he sort of follows it like sort of line by line, or to what extent he is departing from it or adding his own thoughts and so on. Like there are some passages that are pretty clearly like Simondon interpretation, as opposed to just sort of summarizing Breillet's book. And there are other passages that look maybe more like they are like drawn from Breillet. But yeah, I would have to like to do a sort of full interpretation of this text. You would have to go back to Breillet and like analyze where
Right.
Simondon kind of interjects his own thoughts and makes his own interpretations in opposition to that text.
Yeah, in any case, as you said, he obviously has a very strong grasp of history of philosophy.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he chooses in writing Volume 1 to sort of leave all of that out. That he barely refers to other philosophers, and he writes just sort of as if he's sort of generating these ideas out of pure sort of observation or pure thought. So it's an interesting sort of stylistic choice. It does make things harder for the reader in some respects because we have to sort of guess what he might be thinking of when he's sort of alluding to a certain doctrine without like explicitly saying what he's talking about. But that's part of the fun, trying to figure that out.
Is there a discrepancy because he cites more in the work that he does on the history of philosophy?
Yeah, so I think this text, like, because it's a sort of systematic history of philosophy where he's like going through each thinker or each school in succession, you don't have the same sort of, I guess, guessing game to play where you have to figure out what he's referring to or who he's thinking of in a particular passage. Like, you have the section headings that the editors added in that make that clear. Make that clear.
Yeah. The reason I asked is because I was just wondering, kind of curious. I wonder whether that was a sort of demand during Simon's time in like the academic obligation to do a lot of citing of sources. I just wonder whether that was a quote unquote a thing during when Simondon wrote the first part.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry.
Well, yeah, I was also just going to add because there are times with Deleuze's work where people claim that he doesn't cite his sources either too often.
Yeah, it's there's sort of different citational practices. Like, so what is now Volume 1 of Individuation was Simondon's doctoral thesis or habilitation thesis. Or the major thesis. In the French system at the time, you had to present two theses, a major and a minor thesis. So like it was sort of incorporated into the academic system of the time. So even though he's writing in this style with almost no citations, it was still sort of part of the academic system of the time. But then, like, Deleuze is sort of a different case because he uses tons of citations. So sometimes he'll like rely on a secondary source without necessarily saying who he's relying on, or he'll like write in a way that he's like sort of alluding to a certain author, but without explicitly naming them. And I think the French academic tradition of, like, say, the 1960s or late 1950s was pretty loose with citation practices. Like, there wasn't a lot of sort of enforcement of, like, you have to cite X and you have to, have a proper bibliography and everything, which makes things kind of difficult for us studying these works later on. I think there was sort of an assumption that everyone who was reading these works would be like familiar with the intellectual context and would just like know, oh, he's talking about X, even if there's no like explicit citation. But for those of us who are reading from like a different context and who don't necessarily have all that information available, it makes things more difficult sometimes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, okay. I think this is a good place to stop. So hopefully the recording worked properly. I have to check that after. But yeah, so thanks for coming out, and hope to see you next week.